Good evening, everyone, and thank you ever so much for coming along tonight. As you can see in our corridor, we have a rather special guest this evening. Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, an author, and a public intellectual. His book, 12 Rules for Life, went stratospheric in 2018, and its follow-up, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, was published this year. We are absolutely delighted to be able to welcome him to Cambridge, and it's my great pleasure to say, Jordan Peterson, welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
Till the snakes drop, 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 drop from her head, and the whip from out her hands. Music for a while, shall all your cares beguile, shall all, shall shall all your cares beguile, shall all, shall all your cares be gone.
Dr. Peterson, I'd like to move to the audience as quickly as I can tonight, because I'm sure people tonight will have all sorts of many varied and wonderful questions to ask. But I think to get us off to a certain start, why the music? Why did you think that this would be the way to begin our event tonight?
Well, music is a good way to begin anything. And so I thought it was an appropriate celebratory gesture and that it would set the proper tone, let's say. And so that was the reason.
And what sort of, I mean, in your work in general at the moment, what sort of tone are you hoping to reach with people? Because I think one of the things that makes you so...
Peace.
And is that something that has always kind of run through your work, do you think, the tone of peace?
No. Not always. Well, no one should claim to be perfect in their actions, but generally, if I engage in conflict, the reason I engage in it is because I think the alternative is worse. And so, if you're trying to settle things with a family member, there's often a terrible minefield that you have to wander through to reach anything approximating a lasting peace. And avoiding it doesn't make it better. And it's terrible to confront it, and it can be virtually beyond your capacity to tolerate to do it. And so people avoid it very frequently, but that doesn't make peace. It just harbors underground resentment and breeds bitterness and hatred. And so that's not, unless that's what you want, that's not a good solution.
Do you think that, I mean, you talk about peace, I think a lot of your rules for life can be boiled down to things that probably a lot of us would intuitively resonate with, tidy your room, stand up for yourself, be careful in what you say, these kinds of things, a kind of piece of advice that probably would strike people as applicable quite widely. Why do you think it is that some of the things that you've said and the way you've gone about kind of writing up your stuff has been such a phenomenon and caused so many people to sit up and pay attention?
Well, I suppose in some sense those things that we take for granted we regard as obvious, but if we take them for granted and we regard them as obvious and then they're challenged, we often have no idea why they're valuable. So for example, I've had many clients who were considering getting married or not getting married, and they would say to me, well, it's just a piece of paper. And they thought that was a pretty good argument. And that's not a good argument at all. That's an argument that's so shallow that you hardly know where to begin. But, if someone comes up to you on the street and says, defend marriage, it's like, well, what do you know? It's like, how are you going to do that? It's so obvious that it's defensible that you don't have the arguments at hand. I mean, you're not a legal philosopher. And so people who do that, they think they're intelligent because they can put you on the spot. And merely the mere fact that you can't articulate a claim you share with almost everyone in some traditional sense doesn't mean either that you're stupid or that the principle itself is invalid. It just means that we tend not to discuss all those things we agree upon. It doesn't mean they're without merit. So the rules, I mean, I've been criticized, my books have been criticized. Well, they're, self-help. And I think, well, I'm actually not contemptuous of that, so that criticism doesn't bother me. My clinical practice, many of my clients were brought to whatever philosophical understanding they had through so-called self-help books. And if they were reading books, that's not so bad. And what were they trying to do? Improve themselves? I mean, how pathetic is that? And then to pander to an audience that needs self-improvement. It's like, well, so yes, the rules were obvious, but the reasons for them weren't. And so I think the reason the books were popular, or one of the reasons, is that I tried to make a case for why these hypothetically simple, axiomatic, propositional statements were neither simple nor obvious, and why they were also necessary. And people like to be walked through the whole process of the thought that underlies the claim, let's say.
And is it partly about you feeling that those simple things are under attack somewhere?
Actually, that really wasn't the motive for the books. I mean, the motive for the books was really twofold. I'd spent some time investigating various social media outlets back 10 to 15 years ago, I suppose. And I got interested in a website known as Quora, which some of you may be familiar with. I don't know how popular Quora is now, but it was popular for a while. And on Quora, anyone could ask any question and anyone could pose an answer, which was kind of an interesting technological experiment. And then the answers would be upvoted. And I answered about 50 questions on Quora just as an experiment. And the likes for the answers were Pareto distributed. So a very small proportion of my answers got all the likes, like 2 of them. out of 50. And I didn't necessarily think those answers were any better than the rest. Maybe they were, but they struck a chord, obviously. And one of them was very popular, and it was a list of 42 rules that I had written in response to, I believe, a young man's questions about what sort of general principles might be useful in orienting him in life. And so I'd done a lot of clinical work by then, and so I kind of whipped off this list of 42, and it went quite viral. It became one of the most popular answers on Quora within about a 2-week period. And then when a book agent I was working with had approached me at one point about writing something more popular than Maps of Meaning, my first book, which I wouldn't describe precisely as popular. And I'd done a lot of lecturing by that point, and I thought, well, this list of rules seemed to strike a chord, and so in some sense that was a market test. You could look at it that way, or you could look at it as the initiation of dialogue with a potential reading audience. And so I derived 12 rules I thought made a reasonable narrative whole and wrote about them. And then, I had 30 rules left after that for the second book to draw from. And so no, it wasn't. There were chapters that were affected by what I would say emerged as the culture war, but that wasn't the motivation for writing the book. The motivation was really a clinical and pedagogical motivation. I mean, I'd done a lot of clinical work by that time, and I kind of knew how to unpack things down to the point where they were pragmatically applicable, which is something you learn, by the way, if you're trained as a cognitive behavioral psychologist. And the psychoanalytic types, they're more concerned with broad-scale meta-narratives, and the general themes of your life. But if you're a cognitive behavioral psychologist, everything that you do with your client has to be actionable, right? It has to literally be implementable. And I really like the fact that in my clinical practice, I can span that entire spectrum from sort of the highest order moral discussions to, extremely detailed strategic discussions about how to help people organize their immediate environments. And that's not trivial. It's very difficult to properly organize your immediate environment. And that's another thing I try to do with the books, is show that some of these so-called simple things, clean your room. It's like, I'll tell you, this is the truth. I've been trying to organize my office for 3 years. I was flooded by so much mail and so much catastrophe that I fell way behind in my ability to keep my closet organized, my clothes organized. I had 3 years worth of mail sitting in my office at the university, thousands of pieces of mail. And it took a lot of work and it's still not done. I hope I'll have my damn room clean by the time I go out on tour, which is going to happen we go back on the road on 25th of January. And I'm hoping, for symbolic purposes, among other reasons, to have my house in order and beautified again as well. But I like to show that simple things aren't so simple, especially if you try them. I had one client, his mother had died, and it was a large family, and the family kind of fell into disorder after she died because it was all boys, it was all sons and a father. And no one had really picked up the maternal role, the necessary stereotypical maternal role. And he decided he was going to try to do that. And man, his brothers and his father, they weren't happy when he first went to get groceries. They felt that he was kind of trying to take the place of the mother. So there was all that grief that was still there. And then who the hell did he think he was? And et cetera, et cetera. I mean, people's houses aren't in order because that's really hard. It's really hard. And it causes a lot of chaos and strife to try to do it. And so usually it isn't done. And it isn't until you actually try it, like right down to the detail, that you start to understand how difficult it is, and then also how to appreciate. You also start to appreciate how necessary it is. So it's fun shedding light on that sort of thing, and the non-triviality of the ordinary. And part of the reason I concentrate on the individual is because I don't think the things we do are trivial. If you think the things you do are trivial, then you're either bringing a trivial attitude towards them, or you're doing things that you're not doing the things you should be doing, or you're not framing the situation appropriately. So, and you might dispute that, and that's okay, you could, but one thing that my depressive clients, for example, would say, I can't really figure out why anything is worth doing if we're all going to die in the end. It's like, it's fair enough. But I said, I think it was last night at my lecture, I said, if a baby's crying in front of you and you know it's cold or hungry, you don't cease to attend to its distress because the sun is going to envelop the earth in 4 billion years. You think, that's not a good excuse. Well, why not? Why not use that time frame? And your instinctive answer is, well, that's just not the appropriate time frame. And so I would say, well, if you have the the habitual inclination to apply to your own life a time frame or an evaluative framework that reduces what you're doing to meaninglessness, then you should consider whether or not you're using the wrong time frame. Right? If it all of a sudden becomes meaningless, pointless, you're suffering in the work you have to do, well, find a time frame that is appropriate, sufficient unto the day, let's say. That's a good start. So,
I've got a million questions, but I do want to pass over to the audience. So I'll ask one more.
Thank you all for coming, by the way. It's much appreciated. And I've been unbelievably warmly welcomed here, which is pretty good for a magical super Nazi. So,
I just want to ask one more thing, which is, in the wake of the first book, it did phenomenally well, and then you had a reaction that I think probably surprised a lot of people. You went through anxiety, depression, insomnia, pneumonia, all these sorts of adverse psychological, physical reactions to it, which must have been an awful thing to kind of put yourself through and to kind of suffer from as a result of what happened. And my question is, at that point, were there rules for life that you gleaned from the experience of that have changed the way you look now when you look back at the rules you first came up with on Quora, where you think, oh, actually, there were parts that I missed?
One of the things that my writing has been criticized for in general, including Maps of Meaning, was that there was perhaps not enough emphasis placed on the importance of interpersonal relationships. And there weren't many of the rules that dealt exclusively with that. And it certainly was the case that when I was so ill, and when other members of my family were so ill at the same time, that I developed a more acute appreciation for the necessity of close and honest friendships and close and intimate familial relationships. Now, it wasn't like I didn't appreciate that to begin with. I have a very, I wouldn't say happy marriage, because that's not the right way to put it. It's a deep and meaningful relationship I have with my wife, and it's better than mere happiness, although mere happiness is nothing to be despised. And I always found my home with my wife and my kids, and my extended family, I would say, to be a place of refuge and warmth and delight. And I certainly knew when I was dealing with my clinical clients that if they were friendless or lacked an intimate relationship, that left a real void in their life. That's a third of your life, or half your life, perhaps, or perhaps more than that. For me, that was more an implicit part of my life than something I had made explicit in such a detailed manner. And so, but going through all this, because so much of my survival, in fact, and the survival of my wife, I would say as well, depended on the benevolent actions of people who went far above what you might expect from people, even if you were wildly optimistic. And that did produce in me a renewed appreciation for people's capacity to do such things, that sort of selfless love under extreme conditions, and also the necessity of that. So, and that, I would say, in the final analysis, enhanced a certain kind of gratitude I have both to my friends and to my family. So it's not precisely novel, but it certainly deepened my appreciation of such things. I also learned, I would say, more from all of what I went through, the physical aspect of it, the illness, but also the social pressure, that you can't do things. You should do what you need to do, and you should do it well, but it's good to have people to whom you're also distributing not only responsibility, but opportunity, and to let them operate as autonomously as they possibly can around you, because that multiplies your efforts and theirs. And I was never a micromanager as a graduate student supervisor. I had no interest in that. But I did learn that you extend your efforts immeasurably by properly distributing responsibility and the opportunity that goes along with that. And I became more acutely aware of that. And that's helped a lot, because we've had to build fairly sophisticated organizations around us fairly quickly, and they had to be extremely reliable. And it's really something to be able to surround yourself with people who are capable of functioning autonomously and competently and creatively in their own domain. And there's no loss to you at all in that. There's nothing but gain in that. You're not competing with them. There's plenty, there's more than enough for everyone to do, like more than enough. So it's no zero-sum game by any stretch of the imagination. So I just got more acutely aware of all those things, I hope. And I hope I remember that.
Okay, let's take questions from the floor. Please put your hand up. We will try and do as many as we can fit in. We'll go to the person in the middle of that row there. Yes, there. Maybe project if the mic doesn't work.
Okay.
Oh.
Thank you, Jordan, for coming. For weeks, I was thinking of a question to ask you, and I just wrote it down. When you talked about your client's family and the maternal role that needed to be filled, it reminded me of my father passed away when I was 10, and my mom had to fulfill the paternal role. How was your life, structured by the relationship with your parents? What aspects made you into the man you are today? And yeah, I'd like to answer. I don't know if that's too personal.
I just interviewed my father for my YouTube channel about a week and a half ago. Well, I was very fortunate, I would say, in my choice of parents, let's say. My mother is a very good person. She's very easy to get along with. She's a little more agreeable than is probably good for her, and that made it somewhat difficult for her to compete with rather disagreeable men when she entered the workforce. But she prevailed and had a good career after she had been an at-home mother for a number of years. And so she's got a spine, that woman, and despite the fact of her niceness and her pleasantness and her emotional stability, which was also extremely welcome. And she also has a great sense of humor. And one of the things that I really had as a benefit from my mother was that I could always make her laugh. And we joked around a lot. And that was great. That's playful and fun. And I really have no negative memories of my mother, I would say, and really have had almost no negative interactions with her. And so that's quite something. That's quite a gift, and she clearly loved, I have a brother and a sister, she loved all of us, and she was pretty even-handed, and she was a reasonable disciplinarian. If our mother ever got upset at us, which did happen because we did misbehave, we always felt guilty. We never felt that she was oppressing us. We just felt guilty because we'd upset her because she was such a sweet person. And like I said, but she has a spine and she has moral convictions too. And my father's a tough character, and he's relatively low in agreeableness, especially politeness, and although moderate in compassion. And he's a pretty harsh taskmaster, demanding in terms of his standards. And so he was difficult to please. And that's both a blessing and a curse, because the curse is that he's not pleased, but the blessing is that he thinks you can do better. And so, it's really hard to say when someone's on your side, it's not obvious exactly what that means. It's like, well, are they on the side of who you are, or are they on the side of who you could be? And a lot of what is necessary paternal encouragement, I would say, speaking somewhat stereotypically, is being on the side of who you could be. And I thought this through quite carefully as a clinician, because one of the clinical psychologists who had a major impact, I would say, on me intellectually and practically was Carl Rogers. And Rogers preached, let's say, this doctrine of unconditional positive regard. And he's been criticized for that, because if you actually listen to Rogers, even in his interactions with clients, it was pretty obvious that his positive regard wasn't unconditional. And the problem with unconditional positive regard is, well, you know, you're actually not okay the way you are. And right, and who thinks they are? You know, all of us are perfectly, if we have any sense, cognizant of our imperfections. We also hope we're not all we could be because, you know, especially if you're suffering miserably because of your ignorance and your willful blindness and your malevolence, you think, God, I hope there's more to me than this. And you really do hope that. And then to have someone who's on the side of the part of you that could yet be better, that's really something. And I told my clients all the time when they came in for therapy, when I made such things explicit, that, you know, we were in a partnership to bolster the part of them that was aiming up, that was aiming at the good. And it was useful for people to partition themselves to some degree into that part that was aiming up and that could be trusted and relied upon as an aid to further growth, and that part that was, you know, bitter and resentful and angry and sometimes homicidal and sometimes worse than homicidal, and that was clearly aiming down in every possible way. And I wanted to be on the side of the, you know, the better angels of our nature, let's say. And I would say my father was definitely that. And so that was painful in some ways because it was difficult to please him. And he applied the same standards to himself and paid a certain cost for that. But I did know fundamentally that he had my back. And I mean really fundamentally. And I knew that that was not all that common because many of my friends growing up, especially the group of friends I had before almost all of them dropped out of school, so that would have been junior high, they had very contentious relationships with their father that weren't predicated fundamentally on something like a mutual respect. And that was very hard on them. And I suspect also very hard on their fathers. And my father, when my friends used to come over, he cast a dim light on the bunch of juvenile delinquents that I hung around with in junior high, and perhaps for good reason. But they respected him. And they also knew that he was on my side. And so my father gave me an abiding, and then the other thing I should say about him is he spent a tremendous amount of time with me when I was very young, say before I was 5 or 6. He taught me to read. He did that every night for months, and I remember that very vividly, and instilled in me a love of books and a fluency in reading. He believed that I could do what I set my mind to. And he really believed that. And to have someone that believe that of you, that's something, man. And, you know, it was something that I wanted to offer to my clinical clients, you know, because I did believe that there was more to them than the suffering person that was sitting there, and that, you know, with joint diligent effort, we could sift our way through the chaff and find the wheat, and that things could be better. And one of the lovely things about practicing as a clinician was that almost inevitably happened, and sometimes really radically. And then, of course, later it started to happen on a broader scale, and I was seeing that happen in the lives of maybe thousands of people. And so, and my parents, they're still both alive, and they're both doing quite well for people in their mid-80s, and they still have my back. And they spent a lot of time with me last year when I was desperately ill, and they were very helpful. And you know, they've struggled in their marriage like many people do because they're very temperamentally different, my mom and dad. They share conscientiousness, but my mom is an extrovert, my dad is an introvert. And my mom is very agreeable, and my father is relatively disagreeable, and he's very masculine, and she's very feminine. And there's a lot of gap to bridge there, you know, a lot of difficulty in temperamental understanding, but they're both people of good character, and so far for 50 years, it's not too bad, or longer even, because they knew each other when they were quite young. They've managed to keep their marriage intact, and they've been there for me and my brother and my sister and, well, my children who knew them, who we sent them to frequently and who knew them well. And so I was fortunate in that. And we've also been able to negotiate. You know, I had my differences with my dad when I was a teenager, surprise, surprise, but as far as I can tell, there aren't any skeletons in the closet in that part of my family. There's no snakes under the rug. That's all been, at least in relationship to me, that's all been dealt with, and that's a great relief. So.
Any further hands? We'll go to the person there on the back.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. Often you talk about one way to find meaning is in the journey between who you are and who you could be. But how do you make sure that when deciding like who you could be, that you're not aiming too high?
Right.
Because then potentially you could be disappointed.
Oh, that's
So,
a good. That's
but
a
how do
really,
you make sure that it's challenging enough to keep you engaged? On
yeah,
the
that's a really good question. Yeah. Well, that's something you encounter practically in a clinical setting all the time. Well, you know, let's say I was dealing with a client, and maybe that was somebody who, say, a man, 35 years old. He still lived at home, so he was too dependent. His room is a complete bloody catastrophe, and you know he's living like a bratty 13-year-old, and that gets pretty ugly by the time you're 35. You know, and he knew it, and I'm sure his mother knew it, although obviously she put up with it, which was probably her mistake, at least in part. But maybe we decide, well, you know, let's start by cleaning your room. And so as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, you engage in a process called collaborative empiricism. And that's partly to solve the problem that you described as well. How do we know we set the right goal? Well, I'd say, well, go try it and just watch yourself like you don't know who you are and come back next week and we'll see how you did. And maybe, I remember this one client, he came back and he said, you know, I went and got the vacuum cleaner from the closet, which is something I really have never done. And I put that vacuum cleaner in the doorway of my bedroom, crossways, so it blocked the doorway. And then I just walked over it for a whole week. And look, he was completely nonplussed at his own intransigence. And look what he did, eh? He was so resentful and so angry that he, instead of vacuuming his damn bedroom like he planned, he just stuck the vacuum in his own way and then martyred himself over it every day for a week. It's like, okay, then, we're starting to get somewhere with the whole you living at home thing here. And so, well, that was too high a goal for him. And you say, well, how do you know that? It's like, well, he didn't do it, did he? So then what you do practically is you say, well, how about you bring that vacuum cleaner into your room this week, and that's your whole assignment. And just watch what happens when you bring it in. Watch the fantasies that flicker in the back of your mind as you live out your resentment at your therapist for daring to make you bring that vacuum across the threshold of your bedroom. And so if people catch those fantasies, whew, that's quite the bloody nightmare and quite the revelation to themselves, I can tell you, because you have to be one angry person to put a vacuum cleaner in your doorway and walk over it every day for a week. And so then we'd get somewhere. It's like, okay, now we're getting to the bottom of things, you know, but maybe the next week he'd come back, well, with the fantasies at hand and rather shocked as a consequence, but the vacuum cleaner was then in his room. And so he broke the threshold there, you know, and then maybe we'd have to, maybe all he could do was sort out a drawer or half a drawer, something like that. So what you do is, you know, you pick a target that you think is probably reasonable and you can negotiate that with yourself. And what I would do often practically with my clients is I would say, well, your life is not going very well, and that's why you're here. I mean, that wasn't a pronouncement on my part. And I would ask them, you know, what problems they were suffering from, what they were suffering from. But I would usually do a pragmatic analysis of the generic quality of their life. And it's not that hard to do. You can do this for yourself. It's part of this self-authoring program that I have online. Well, I'm miserable and I'm anxious and I'm bitter and I'm angry and I'm stuck in my career and I don't seem to be able to get anywhere and God damn it, life isn't worth living anyways, and so half the time I'm suicidal. It's like, okay, you know, right? Now we've established the problem domain, right? At least somewhat. And then I would say, well, hypothetically, you'd rather that some of that wasn't the case, right? So because we want to establish a goal, what is it you want? More misery or less misery? And usually by the time people had come to therapy, unless they were mandated to do so, which never works, by the way, they wanted things to be better. That's why they were there. You know, now and then you get someone who was there just to, you know, maybe please someone else, but I could usually get beyond that, because if they were willing to come there was at least a part of them that was hoping that there was such a thing as up. And then we'd just walk through their life. It's like, okay, well, Let's do an assessment. Do you have any friends? And how often do you see them? Well, I have 6 friends, but I only see them once every 6 months, one of them every 6 months. Well, that's pretty low on the friendship hierarchy. So I just file that away as a piece of evidence. Do you have an intimate relationship? Are you as educated as your intelligence would indicate might be useful? Do you have a job? Do you have a career? Or failing that, a job? Right? Because generally people need at least a job and perhaps hopefully a career. How do you regulate your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a major pitfall for people. How do you use your leisure time? How do you take care of yourself mentally and physically? Now, that's not everything about life, right? But if you don't have any of that, well, we have a place to start then, like maybe you should try to make one friend. And there are ways of doing that. So, for example, one of the things that my wife and I used to do when we moved to a new place, which we did fairly often, was we'd pick some local hangout place, restaurant, bar, something like that, and we just go there every week. And until we started to know, at least the proprietors, we'd introduce ourselves and we'd make that a routine. And then, you can get to know people. And sometimes with my clients, I would have to, some of them were incredibly not socially skilled, like in ways you just have no idea. Well, maybe some of you do. How? Well, because I don't mean you specifically, although maybe I do, but you certainly may know people like this. I had one client who was literally so socially anxious he could not use a telephone. And so he was he was absolutely terrified of people. He'd been horribly bullied. He was 3/4 deaf. He had obsessive compulsive disorder. He had an intellectual impairment. I mean, this guy had a rough time, man. And he was so terrified he could hardly talk to men and women, man. They were so terrifying to him. He just didn't even know literally where to start. Well, sometimes when people are extremely impaired, they don't know anything basic. They have no friends. This is why. Well, they introduce themselves like this. What's your name? And then maybe you say it, but they're so preoccupied that they don't hear it, and then they shake hands. So let's shake hands. That's not good. That's not good. You don't remember the name. You're not making eye contact, so you can't see the person's emotional response, and then you're afraid, and that's why you're looking away. And then because you're afraid and you're looking away, you don't pick up the social cues about how to initiate conversation, even if you know how to do that. So then you're awkward, and because you're looking away, you don't listen, and then you can't enter into the flow of conversation. And so we'd practice shaking hands, maybe 20 times till the person could do it and was comfortable with it. And, that's how you start at the bottom of things. And that's a goal for someone like that, because you have to look at, well, you don't have any friends. It's like, well, what the hell's going on here? Well, for him, like I said, he had intellectual impairments, and, well, the deafness didn't help, and neither did the obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, the guy had a lot of obstacles standing in his way. And so we had to find, a place to start. But we would set those 7 goals. It's like, well, maybe you could have a friend or 2, and maybe you could do something that would educate yourself to some degree, and maybe we can take some steps towards moving you towards a job. With him, I started trying to get him a volunteer job, which you think would be easy, but which is actually practically, just so you know it, when you're thinking about people struggling at the bottom who are unemployed, it's like, why don't they get a volunteer job, say, to start them in the process? It's bloody well harder to get a volunteer job than a real job. You need a police check for most volunteer positions if they deal with personal care, because people are so afraid of litigation. And for someone who's basically illiterate and also who has extreme social anxiety, the whole police check thing wasn't working. And I sent him to an employment office, and they said, well, type up your resume and distribute it. It's like, that's real helpful. He can't type, he's barely literate. He's never used a computer. He doesn't know what a resume is even. It's like, type up your resume and distribute it. Jesus, how pathetic. So one of the things you do if you negotiate with yourself is I'm going to set a goal and then see if you move towards it. And if you don't, well, maybe it's the wrong goal. Maybe it's too large. Maybe it's too small for you, right? So now it's not engaging you. Maybe you didn't really want to pursue that goal and you're just deluding yourself. And, it's helpful to have someone to talk those things over with, but I would say start from if you're not doing what you want to do or what you think you should be doing, drop the presumption that you know who you are and start to negotiate with yourself like you're a stranger who needs to be enticed forward. Because you don't know who you are, especially if you're not able to regulate your behavior, because that's evidence that you don't know who you are. Something is driving the ship. It's not you, or it's not the you think you are. And that's often extremely humiliating to people, because you may have to pick a goal that's so low, so lowly, right, that you embarrass yourself half to death by recognizing the necessity of you having to practice that. But the upside of that is that improvement, incremental improvement, scales exponentially. So even if you have to start somewhere really trivially, man, once you start, you can really scale up quickly. And so, and with an exponential increase, which I think improvement is, the trajectory of improvement is characterized by a power law function. It doesn't really matter where you start if you're doubling. Look, think you get 1% better a week. That's not that high a goal, right? Maybe you could get rid of 1% of your stupidity and malevolence a week, or maybe every 2 weeks. Because that compounds, in 3 years, you are a completely different person. And it doesn't end there. So even if you're starting with, the horrible mixed bag of catastrophes that you actually are, if you're diligent in your attempts to rectify your errors and to aim higher, man. And then with regards to your goals, let's say you don't know what to do. Well, maybe you're high in openness, and so you're pulled in all sorts of directions, or maybe you're low in conscientiousness, or you're confused because you're anxious, or you haven't had any direction, you haven't had good mentoring, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of reasons. Well, I would say pick something, right? Pick something, a nameable goal, and then try to implement it. And what'll happen is you'll learn a lot by trying to implement it. And one of the things you might learn is what a slightly better goal might be. Because if you try something diligently and you succeed or you fail, you're going to learn from the effort expended in the detailed implementation of the goal is going to inform you. It'll also transform you physiologically. It does that at a very basic level, neurophysiological level. You will be slightly different as a consequence of the attempt. And what that'll mean is that the next goal you pick will be a little more suited to you. And so it's this kind of pathway, right? It's like maybe the goal you should be attaining is here, but you don't know that because you're clueless. And so you aim there. Well, it's better than there. And it's not nothing. It's not cessation of movement. And, if you're supposed to go there and you go here, but you walk diligently towards it, you're a little closer once you get to here than you were here. And it's this oscillating self-corrective process that leads you to the final star. And you have to be willing to engage in erroneous experimentation to manage that, but it is a self-correcting process. And so one of the things I always talk to my clients about is, well, let's try something, and we'll reserve to ourselves the right to alter our trajectory. And then I would use as a corrective there, because you might say, well, how do you know when you're not just giving up, right? Instead of thinking maybe you need a different goal. And I would say, well, you can, if you're really concerned about your proclivity for self-deception, you can enter into a contract with yourself that you won't replace any goal you've set with a goal that's easier. And so you can switch your goal, but it has to be a little harder so that you check yourself against that tendency to withdraw and avoid and be self-deceptive. And that works like a charm. And if you do that with some degree of diligence, your goals will get better and more attainable, and you'll get happier too, because you don't experience happiness except in relationship to a goal. And that's really worth knowing. And that's another thing to think about too. If your life is meaningless, well, you're not pursuing a valued goal. You might be depressed too, and sometimes that can be like an illness, something that is really wrong with you. But a good rule of thumb is that if you find no joy in life, there's a very low probability that you're pursuing a goal that you regard intrinsically, like in the depths of your temperament, as worthwhile. And that's technically true, because we do in fact experience most of the positive emotion, let's say, that's associated with emotions like joy. We experience that in relationship to a goal. So, well, then you want to find a goal that regulates your negative emotion and that brings you a certain amount of positive emotion and that expands your competence as you pursue it. And you will experience that as meaningful. That's really what meaning signals. Meaning signals you're doing all those things. You say, well, that's not real. It's like, don't listen to the semantic chatterbox so much, right? There's levels of you that are far wiser than that. And you can watch what happens to you instead of noticing what you think. You know, and that's another thing I always did with my clients, especially if they're depressed. It's like, well, let's watch you for a week and let's see when you're not so depressed. What are you doing when you're not so depressed? Now, for some people who had an endogenous depression, they were just depressed all the time. And sometimes an antidepressant was a good solution to that. But for people who were situationally depressed, which is equally common, let's say, there'd be quite a bit of variation in their mood. And say, well, it turns out that I'm not so depressed when I'm with so-and-so. It's like, okay, well, why? And more importantly, how can we do more of that? And when were you more depressed? Well, when I'm alone in my room, brooding. Okay, well, how about you spend 10% less time this week alone in your room? Like, we'll introduce 10%, let's say. So you're awake for 16 hours, so that's an hour. Now we'd probably go for 5%, half an hour. That's a hell of an improvement over 20 weeks, right? Because that would be 100% less time doing counterproductive brooding. It's like, well, maybe you could go for a 5-minute walk every day this week. Or maybe a 2-minute walk, Or maybe you go in the living room instead of your bedroom if you can't manage the walk. And so that's part of that collaborative empiricism too, right? Let's find out when your life isn't announcing itself to you as meaningless. And virtually no one feels the absence of meaning all the time. Even nihilistic punk rockers like going to the local bar and smashing into each other in the mosh pit. So I know that's a dated reference, but you get what I mean. So.
Okay. A lot of very eager hands. And we'll go to the person in the blue headband there.
Hello. So you talked a bit about how your view on relationships has changed. And since you talked at the union 3 years ago, how have your other opinions changed and why?
Well, one thing that's changed, most of this is a deepening, I would say, rather than a transformation of beliefs. But it's a deepening and a specification of things that I more dimly apprehended before. One of the things I've really learned more explicitly, I would say, in the last 6 months is to not win. I knew this already. Like in my clinical practice, I tried my best not to be right. So for example, as a clinician, you can dispense advice. And so it'd be quite easy, especially if I wasn't suffering at that time while practicing as a clinician. And the person was, I think, well, I've got my life together pretty well, and I'll just tell you what you should do. And sometimes people would ask for that, right? But it's not that helpful because, well, what the hell do you know about what they should do? You can introduce topics of conversation like, well, most people have friends and you don't seem to have any, and, maybe you have a reason for that, and maybe it's a, fundamentally valid reason, and that's not where your interests are oriented. Maybe you're particularly introverted, which doesn't mean you don't need friends. But that's way different than saying, well, here's what you should do. And the problem with here's what you should do is, first of all, as the psychoanalysts knew, you just set up resistances in people. And the reason, so they won't do it, even if they want your advice, and often they'll do the opposite, just out of spite, and probably they should, because they're basically saying, up yours. It's like, this is my life, man, not yours. And the other problem with advice is, well, let's say you take my advice and then you go do something good. It's like, well, whose victory is that? Is it yours or mine? So did I just steal your victory? Well, that's not so good. And so I learned that pretty thoroughly as a clinician, not to do that, and hopefully as a husband and father, also not to do that. But in my talks with people like Sam Harris, I was more instrumental than I should have been. There were points I was trying to make, and I was trying to be right. And, there's times for that, and there's partisan situations where only one side can win and another side has to lose. An election is like that. But I've really learned, I hope, that in the last 6 or 7 months to not do that, not to do that. And so the last conversation I had with Sam Harris, which was 2 weeks ago, which will be released in relatively short order, was by far the best conversation we ever had. And all I did was ask him questions. And that wasn't manipulative. It wasn't like, well, I'm going to, and no one here in the audience has done this yet, but lots of times people ask me questions. They're not questions. They're disguised criticisms, or they're statements of belief, or they're an observation that perhaps if my Christian beliefs, for example, were more fully differentiated, and I accepted Christ as my Savior, that would be a good thing. That comes up quite often. And they're not questions. Like a question is something you want the answer to. Like actually, you want to know what the person thinks. And so all I did was ask Harris questions. And I learned all sorts of things about the way he thought that I didn't know, and about commonalities in our approach to problems that I didn't understand. And the conversation was much more enjoyable. I mean, the give and take of our previously more tendentious conversations had, what would you say? There was an element of sort of combative enjoyment to them. So they weren't nothing, and they were reasonably successful as public spectacles, and I suppose as philosophical investigations. But this was way better, way better. And I understood what motivated Sam way more than I did before. And I've been doing a lot of, I hope, political peacemaking between Democrats and Republicans in the US, because that better happen. And, I've managed on the moderate Democrat side to convince, to learn along with a variety of moderate Democrats that even when dealing with their, the people across the aisle, that winning is not a good strategy, or maybe it's better than losing. Let's say it's not an optimal strategy, right? That's a better way of thinking about it. And if you're trying to win a conversation, that might be better than losing, but it's not as good as mutual elevation in the progression of the discourse. That's way better. That's a real victory. And so I hope that I've learned that more deeply, and that I can take that to heart more deeply, and then I can govern my actions. I have conversations that are very tense with people. Well, I always have, and that certainly hasn't stopped, and I have to tread very carefully. And any instrumentalism on my part, because one of the things you want to do when you win is dominate in some sense, right? And that's a cheap victory, I would say. It's better than losing, perhaps. Because sometimes you can retreat and let the other person have the floor, let's say. But it's not the optimal solution, not at all. And man, you just have no idea how far you can get with people if what you do is ask them questions because you're interested in what they think. And it's so damn useful for them, because then in the discourse, they reveal elements of themselves that they really didn't know. And what's also interesting, I've seen people do this. I had a striking example of that within my own family, where one of my family members had a grudge against another. And we waited it out instead of confronting it directly. And the person with the grudge laid out why they had the grudge. And it was a character description of the person they were angry with. And it was so unlike the person that while the person who had the grudge was revealing the story, they realized that this was some fantasy they'd concocted like 15 years previously, and pretty much abandoned it right after the utterance. And so that happens frequently, if you really disagree with someone. First of all, that's interesting because you're wrong and stupid. And if they really disagree with you, they might know something that you really need to know, right? Rather than talking to someone that already agrees with you. I mean, that's hard because there's still points of conflict, but it's worth digging for that if you can find it. And then there's also the possibility that many of the differences are purely misunderstandings. That's very frequently the case. And then there's also the possibility that while the person engages in this dialogue, well, first of all, they're happy about you because you're listening, and people love that, man. They love that. More than you listen to people, you really listen to them instead of thinking about what you're going to say next or trying to win. You'll have so many people around you so soon that you won't even be able to stand it. So that's really something, man, to do that. And so that's a pathway to peace, that listening, that's for sure. And it's a pathway to wisdom, because if you listen to people, then they tell you all sorts of things you don't know. And that's true of people no matter their position in society, man. I mean, And that's another thing I learned in my clinical practice. If I was bored by my client, I was doing it wrong. Because if I really listened to them, they were not boring, man. They were so damn interesting, you could hardly even stand to be in the same room. So, and I think that's true. And you know that's true. You know, you break through that facade, that persona, because you're having a genuine interaction. And it becomes as richly meaningful as listening to a symphony or something like that. And you remember that, you know, and you feel that there's soul-to-soul contact in that. And there is. And that's what brings peace to the world. That's what revitalizes everyone, right? And so I hope I learned that more deeply. And we'll see. We'll see, right?
Should we go to someone who's waving their fingers right at the back over there? Yes, that person.
Okay, just to shift the thing a little bit, what do you think you would like to be remembered for? Like your political...
Living.
Sorry?
Sorry.
Sorry. Like the things you've done politically or your other ventures, like your books, your clinical practice, etc., etc. What do you think you'd like to be remembered for more? Like,
Encouraging people. That's all, really. That's something.
Shall we go back to the person who gave
Dr. Peterson, thank you for coming. My question is related to your previous statements on how to bring, in a sense, more unity in a very divided world. I'm wondering what are the things that you look forward to with hope that could bring togetherness?
Well, that ties into this issue of encouragement, you know. I mean, when I wrote my first book, I wrote it over about I guess I started it really in 1984 and I finished it in 1999, so 15 years. And I wrote pretty much 3 hours a day, every day. And I thought about what was in that book manically, I would say, hypomanically anyways, for at least 12 of those years. So I was just thinking about it all the time. Well, not all the time. I was doing some research in other areas at the time, but that all tied into it. So pretty much all the time. And I was obsessed with the Auschwitz phenomenon, I would say, is obsessed with atrocity, but psychologically, right? Not economically, not sociologically, none of that, I thought. Trusty Auschwitz guard committing atrocity. There's one famous story that I came across. I think it was in Man's Search for Meaning, Frankel, but it might not have been. So, you know, the people who came to the concentration camps who were transported, they were transported in cattle cars essentially, and many of them in the winter froze to death if they were on the outside of the cattle car, or were suffocated in the middle. And so, and you know, they were separated from their families, and there were people of different nationalities and different language families all crammed together, so they were as alienated and broken as people could possibly be. And you'd think that'd be enough, really, wouldn't you? But no. You come to the camp, and the people in the cars would cheer if they came to a camp that had no chimney. And so that shows you what joy is like under those conditions. So one of the tricks that the guards used to play in Auschwitz was they'd get these people after this brutal transport to pick up like 100-pound sack of wet salt and carry it from one side of the compound to the other and back. And compound, that's not like an area this size. Those places were small cities. They had 50,000 people in them, some of the camps. So it was a walk across town after you'd been separated from your family and just about froze to death and were 3/4 dead and had everything stripped away. It's like, just who the hell did you have to be to then subject that person to work for no other reason than to prolong their suffering, right? Because Solzhenitsyn said, you know, when he was in the camps, that at least if he was laying bricks in a wall, or a bricklayer was doing so, at least he had the satisfaction of building something, right? There there was some tiny iota of meaning in the work, something redemptive in that, a crumb that you could feast on in the midst of your starvation. But whoever came up with this particular torment figured out how to make work itself counterproductive, right? Work itself nothing but a means to more suffering. And you remember the joke on the outside of the Auschwitz camp, Arbeit macht frei. That's my German is terrible. Work will set you free. Someone made a joke about that. I wanted to think about it. Just exactly what would you have to be like to make that joke? And part of the reason I wanted to figure that out is because I'm a human being, and a human being made that joke. And a human being forced that punishment onto someone who was already suffering. And I wanted to figure out what you would have to be like, what I would have to be like to do that. I thought if I could figure that out, then I could figure out what the opposite of that was, right? Because maybe such things should be brought to a halt. That's what we were supposed to remember from the concentration camps, which we're continually reminded never to forget, as well. You do not remember what you cannot understand. And so we think, well, evil people did this, and hey, man, fair enough, But don't be so sure that those people aren't you. And so that's a horrible thing to contemplate, but a necessary thing to contemplate. And I would say also that if you don't contemplate it, you end up placing that great evil somewhere else, right? In some other person, in some other race, in some other political party. That's going somewhere. And if it's not part of your own heart and the fight isn't there, well, you're going to have the fight somewhere. So I thought about that for a long time, and then what I concluded was that the way out of that is to make better people at the individual level. It's a psychological issue, fundamentally, not a sociological issue, not an economic issue, certainly not an economic issue, not a political issue. It is all those things to some degree, not fundamentally. There's no political reason to have some suffering person under your dominion carry a sack of wet salt that weighs 100 pounds from one side of a compound to another. No, that's you, man, corrupt right to hell. And so, you think that's pretty terrible, and it is pretty terrible, but there is one advantage to specifying evil in a very distinctive and precise manner, is that when you specify something that precisely, you also specify its opposite. Right? So if there's evil of that depth, then, well, there, at least in principle, might be the opposite of that, which would be the force that might resist it. And so while I was looking into the heart of darkness, let's say, the light started to shine through. And, that partly when I started to understand, it was a little bit before that you should not lie. That's a big mistake. You think you can, first of all, I'll tell you one thing, that I never saw any of my clinical clients ever get away with anything, ever. We track their misery back to its origination point, and sometimes it was a mistake on their part, often a moral error, which they knew was a moral error when they were committing it, but may have forgotten about afterwards, so became unconscious in some sense, or habitual, or it was a moral error that someone else, that they were beholden to, a lie on the part of their mother or father, someone they were tangled up with, someone malevolent. But yeah, the pigeons come home to roost, man. And how could it be otherwise? You really think you have the capacity to bend the structure of reality without it eventually snapping back and hitting you in the face? Like, how arrogant can you possibly be to think that? And so, well, I came to believe that truth in particular, spoken truth, but not only spoken truth, was the antidote to that evil and to that suffering, really, truly the antidote to that. It's more complex than that, but that's something. And I also came to believe that each of us have far more under our dominion in terms of the destiny of the world, let's say, than we would ever even care to dare to dread, let's say. I don't know how it works, but each of us, we make decisions between heaven and hell all the time. With every decision, in fact. With every decision. That's a decision, up or down. And in some manner, the whole collective enterprise is guided by those individual decisions. And it's not washed away in the mix, it's somehow not just your trivial action in a sea of 7 billion random actions. We're networked, and our actions echo, and what we do or don't do, or what we do deceitfully, has ramifications far beyond what we can immediately see, or often are willing to immediately see. It's like, the only more frightening realization than nothing you do matters is the realization that everything you do matters. It's like you want to pick an existential terror. You think meaninglessness is terrifying. You try its opposite, and you'll see how terrifying that is. But it's a terror, it's a holy terror, right? It's a terror that sustains and ennobles. And every single person knows that that is true. Knows that you're fleeing from your destiny by avoidance of the necessary responsibility that your conscience calls you towards. Everyone knows that. And we toy with it because we can, and we try to avoid it because we test, we're immature, and we're bitter often, and it's not surprising because people suffer dreadfully, and it's very difficult to suffer dreadfully without becoming bitter, but it doesn't help. All it does is make the suffering worse and spreads it, and if the suffering is morally objectionable, spreading it is hardly going to rectify that. And so, I'm optimistic about our possibilities because I think we can do anything we set our minds to. And so, hopefully, we'll set our minds to the proper things. And every single one of you have to make that decision. And one of the things I've really been struck by, I talked with Andy No 2 weeks ago. I'd spoken to some moderate Democrats about Antifa. And they said, Antifa is a loser. It's an illusion. It doesn't exist. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting because you think these right-wing conspiratorial groups exist. And then when I talk to the Republicans, they're pretty damn sure Antifa exists and that the right-wing conspiratorial groups don't. The language is precisely parallel across the aisles. It's so interesting. But I talked to Andy No. I said, these moderate Democrats, they told me Antifa is illusory. I said, well, you've had more interactions with Antifa than anyone on the planet. He's beat 3/4 to death twice and sustained brain damage that took him a year to recover and still went back out to cover the riots. He had to move away from the United States because he had too many death threats. It's like, one death threat, that's enough. When you start to aggregate them, that's rough. I said, well, how many Antifa cells do you think there are? 20. Well, how many committed Antifa types do you think there are? And I don't think they're necessarily left-wing radicals, by the way. I think they're people who love mayhem and they sow discord and they have a quasi-fascist paramilitary structure. So that's kind of weirdly right-wing. And to put that in the context of some political debate is inappropriate because they're people who want everything to burn so they can dance in the ashes. And so well, we'll leave it at that. So there's 800 of them out of 300 million. That's like zero, right? Well, so the moderate Democrats can say, well, it's an illusion. Well, God, it's only 800 people in a city of 500,000, 420,000, let's say. That would be one person. So it's statistically negligible. But unfortunately, it's not because, man, you can cause a lot of trouble if you want to. And so we're always in this situation, and I think it's even more precarious now, where what you do really matters. You think about how much technological power each one of you wields, and that's just going to scale exponentially as we become more able to manipulate everything around us. And what that means is the cumulative consequences of our individual inadequacies are going to be the biggest threat that is posed to us in the future. And so better people, that's the way forward. And I think that that's not only possible, but let's say, necessary, desirable, good, beautiful, everything positive. There's everything positive in that. So
we have already overrun slightly, so what I'd like is one more question. Does anyone have anything that can be answered briefly?
that's more my problem.
Okay, a lot of very committed people who are going with things. You said I had an upstairs bias, a downstairs bias. Yeah. Should we go upstairs, someone?
How about this side?
We'll go there. That bloke there. Yes, okay. There's a mic coming. There we go.
And whatever you have said has had a very positive impact in my life. So my question to you is, what's your one most important advice to someone who's going to be a parent soon?
Well, the first thing I would say about that is that you have the opportunity in front of you to have the best relationship with anybody you've ever had in your life. You know, if you do that right, that's what you can have. You know, and you have to kind of scour yourself for resentments. That's the first thing. And a little house cleaning is in order, you know, because a baby's a lot of responsibility, and you got to talk over with your wife who does what and when and why, and that's hard, right, to make peace in the household like that, especially in an age where the gender war rages, let's say. And so you want to decide if that's what you want, you know. You want to compete with your kid, you want to quell his ambition or her ambition when it manifests itself in a positive way because you're jealous about that purity, because you can certainly do that. Nietzsche said, you know, we're best punished for our virtues, so you can just wait around till your child does something delightful and good and toss a little punishment in there, and that'll bring that to an end very, very, very quickly. You know, you can make a dog starve to death by hitting him on the nose with a newspaper when he approaches his food dish. It doesn't take much. You have to do that 20 times and the dog will starve to death. So there's some advice if you want to make your life miserable. So I would say, you know, we want to decide if you want the best relationship you ever had in your life. And if you do, then the next thing I would say is cooperate with your wife and negotiate. And don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Because if you dislike them, you can bloody well be sure other people will. And you can guide them, you know, and part of that's that acceptant maternal love that sort of encompasses everything. Some of that's the discriminating encouragement that fosters further growth, and you want a balance of that in your household. And then you can have love and joy and play, you know, and that's little walled garden. That's paradise where people play forever, happily. So aim up, tell the truth, negotiate with your wife, shed your resentment, and love and encourage your children.
I think we could let this event run on for about another 12 hours with the number of questions we have coming. But alas, there are things to do. Thank you ever so much, Dr. Peterson, for coming and speaking with us today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very, very much. Let's stand up.